In his book Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis popularized the argument that Jesus is either a liar, a lunatic, or Lord. This argument wasn't original with Lewis, however. It was probably first clearly spelled out in the 19th century by John Duncan, who wrote, "Christ either deceived mankind by conscious fraud, or he himself was deluded and self-deceived, or he was divine. There is no getting out of this trilemma, it is inexorable." If you think about it, this line of reasoning can be traced back even further. John's Gospel implicitly gives us this trilemma sprinkled throughout the text. John 8:55 says, "If I say that I do not know him, I will be a liar like you, but I know him and I keep his word." John 10:21 says, "Many of them said he has a demon and is insane. Why do you listen to him?" And John 8:58 says, "Verily I tell you," Jesus answered, "before Abraham was born, I am." Alright, so what about this argument? It's logically valid, but is it sound? Well, many would quickly respond with a resounding no. That's because there is another option that Lewis apparently didn't consider. Modern biblical criticism has shown that the Gospels are a mix of fact and legend. In a thread criticizing Lewis's trilemma, comedian Rhett McLaughlin proposed a dilemma of his own. Lewis was either not well versed in these matters as many thought, or he figured his readers were not well versed enough to raise this seemingly obvious objection. Ouch. Rhett continues on to say that there are a lot of conservative scholars that have pointed this issue out as well, and to be honest, he's right. William Lane Craig, probably the most well-known apologist on the planet, has said that this argument needs to be set aside. In his classic work, Reasonable Faith, Craig writes, "It is naive and outdated simply to trot out the dilemma liar, lunatic, or Lord, and adduce several proof texts where Jesus claims to be the Son of God, the Messiah, and so forth. The publicity generated by the Jesus Seminar has rendered that approach forever obsolete. Rather, if an apologetic based on the claims of Christ is to work, we must do the requisite spade work of sorting out these claims of Jesus that can be established as authentic, and then drawing out their implications." Craig does attempt to establish Jesus' self-understanding using various criteria used by biblical scholars like the criterion of embarrassment, dissimilarity, multiple attestation, and so forth. Doing so, he tries to do an end round around Jesus' strong claims that are found in the Gospel of John. While I do think that we can make some serious progress towards a high Christology using text only found in Mark's Gospel or the Synoptics, I'm not fully persuaded that it gets us past the goal line. And I suspect that Lewis would say that this approach is wrong-headed. Well, why exactly is that? Well, what if I told you that Lewis wasn't the dumb bunny or the dishonest apologist that his critics make him out to be? The fact is that Lewis considered the legend option. He just wasn't moved by the field of modern biblical criticism the way some evangelical apologists are today. In 1959, Lewis addressed a number of Anglican ordinands at Cambridge on the subject of historical criticism in biblical studies. Many English church leaders had embraced higher criticism, and Lewis felt compelled to play the embarrassing role of missionary to his own priests. Lewis, a layperson, addresses those leaders saying, "I am a sheep telling shepherds what only sheep can tell them, and now I begin my bleating." Lewis has 4 bleats, to be exact. I'm going to provide a sampling by sharing some quotes, and a link where you can find the full essay in the description. For starters, Lewis brought in his own professional experience as a literary critic in his first line of attack against modern scholars, and he didn't pull any punches. He discusses the realistic dialogues in John's Gospel and how it stands in stark contrast to the other literature of its time. Calling into question the biblical critic's reading comprehension, Lewis wrote, "I have been reading poems, romances, vision literature, legends, myths all my life. I know what they're like. I know that not one of them is like this. Of this text, there are only 2 possible views. Either this is reportage, though it may no doubt contain errors, pretty close up to the facts, nearly as close as Boswell, or else some unknown writer in the 2nd century without known predecessors or successors suddenly anticipated the whole technique of modern, novelistic, realistic narrative. If it is untrue, it must be a narrative of that kind. The reader who doesn't see this has simply not learned to read." Lewis's second bleat is him pointing out the extreme improbability that the early church came to so quickly misunderstand the message of Jesus, only for it to be later rescued by modern critics. He wrote, "All theology of the liberal type involves at some point, and often involves throughout, the claim that the real behavior and purpose and teaching of Christ came to be rapidly misunderstood and misrepresented by his followers, and has been recovered or exhumed only by modern scholars. Most of their interpretations are merely impossible. The idea that any man or writer should be opaque to those who lived in the same culture, spoke the same language, share the same habitual imagery and unconscious assumptions, and yet be transparent to those who have none of those advantages is, in my opinion, preposterous." In his third bleat, Lewis discussed the biblical critic's strong anti-supernatural bias. He wrote, "Thirdly, I find in these theologians a constant use of the principle that the miraculous does not occur. Thus, any statement put into our Lord's mouth by the old text, which, if he had really made it, would constitute a prediction of the future, is taken to have been put in after the occurrence which it seemed to predict. This is very sensible if we start by by knowing that inspired prediction can never occur. Similarly, in general, the rejection as unhistorical of all passages which narrate miracles is sensible if we start by knowing that the miraculous in general never occurs. Now, I do not here want to discuss whether the miraculous is possible. I only want to point out that it is a purely philosophical question. Scholars as scholars speak on it with no more authority than anyone else. The canon, if miraculous, then unhistorical, is one they only bring to the study of the text, not one that they have learned from it. Lest you think that Lewis is beating on a straw man, here's D.F. Strauss, the pioneer of historical Jesus studies. Strauss wrote, "The contradiction between the supernatural accounts and the natural element, which alone is historically available, could not be reconciled so long as the Gospels, or even a single one of them, was taken as truly fully historical. This indeed they could not be, for the simple reason that they contain supernaturalism." This isn't limited to scholars in the past. Gerd Ludemann has said that anybody who says that he rose from the dead is faced with another problem. Namely, if you say that Jesus rose from the dead biologically, you would have to presuppose that a decaying corpse, which is already cold and without blood in its brain, could be made alive again. I think that is nonsense. Michael Goulder, another New Testament scholar, said, "Even if speculative, a natural explanation is to be preferred." And of course, Bart Ehrman has argued at length that a miracle is by definition the most improbable of events, and a historian can only establish what probably happened in the past, and so therefore historians can never establish that a miracle happened. This is of course just David Hume's argument warmed over, and many philosophers have rejected Hume's reasoning for many reasons, which I would discuss in other videos. In his final loudest bleat, Lewis excoriates the critics for their highly speculative accounts of how the New Testament texts were written and how early Christian thought developed. In his discussion, Lewis gives modern examples of how easily modern reviewers can misunderstand the work of their own contemporaries, even Lewis himself. If this can happen to someone living at the same time as Lewis, why should we put tons of stock in the theories of biblical critics? Lewis wrote, "Consider with what overwhelming advantages the mere reviewers start with. They reconstruct a history of a book written by someone whose mother tongue is the same as theirs, a contemporary, educated like themselves, living in something like the same mental and spiritual climate. They have everything to help them. A superiority in judgment and diligence which you are going to have to attribute to the biblical critics will have to be almost superhuman if it is to offset the fact that they are everywhere faced with customs, language, race characteristics, class characteristics, a religious background, habits of composition, and basic assumptions which no scholarship will ever enable any man now alive to know as surely and intimately and instinctively as the reviewer can know mine. And for the very same reason, remember the biblical critics, whatever reconstructions they devise, can never crudely be proved wrong." Lewis also makes a strong point from a mathematical point of view. He notes that favoring complex theories over simple ones is a bad habit of New Testament scholarship and leads to the problem of dwindling probabilities. He writes, "When a critic reconstructs the genesis of a text, he usually has to use what may be called linked hypotheses. Thus, Bultmann says that Peter's confession is an Easter story projected backward into Jesus' lifetime. The first hypothesis is that Peter made no such confession. Then granting that, there is a second hypothesis as to how the false story of his having done so might have grown up. Now let us suppose, what I am far from granting, is that the first hypothesis has a probability of 90%. Let us assume that the second hypothesis also has a probability of 90%. But the two together don't have a 90% probability, for the second comes in only on the assumption of the first. You have not A plus B, you have complex AB, and the mathematicians tell me that AB only has an 81% probability. I'm not good enough at arithmetic to work it out, but you can see that in a complex reconstruction, you could go on thus, superinducing hypothesis on hypothesis. You will in the end get a complex in which, though each hypothesis by itself has in this sense a high probability, the whole has almost none." From Lewis's outsider vantage point, the gospel genre lacks the typical characteristics of legend, based on a lifetime of reading ancient legends both from a scholarly and leisurely perspective. And Lewis wasn't impressed with the bandwagon appeals to consensus because of his own experience. Lewis said, "I have learned in other fields of study how transitory the assured results of modern scholarship may be, how soon scholarship ceases to be modern." Whatever you might think of Lewis's thoughts on biblical scholarship, the idea that he was either ignorant of the topic or was hoping his audience isn't well founded. For Lewis, the Jesus of the four Gospels is the Jesus of history. If Jesus were not Lord, he would be liar or lunatic, yet he is sane and he is truthful, therefore he is Lord. Either Rhett and his critics like him are not well versed in these matters, or they figure their followers were not well versed enough to raise this seemingly obvious objection. And rather than playing along with the modern biblical critics and trying to use their ill-fitting and faulty tools to make his point like some evangelical apologists, Lewis chose to run after the Goliath of scholarly consensus instead.